Okay, if we're ready to get started, I'd like to introduce our next panel. My name is Tom Leininger. I'm a professor here at the University of Oregon School of Law. And before we get started with this panel, I just wanted to recognize the great work done by the students involved with our Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. Let's thank those students for doing that. I'm a professor who focuses on evidence, ethics, and environmental law, coincidentally all subjects that start with the letter E. I'm trying to work my way down the alphabet, but right now I'm stuck on E. I am very pleased to be part of a panel that includes two experts of huge stature from far and wide. This panel will focus on the interface of federal land and private land and some challenges that arise with respect to policy that regulates wildfire risks, attempts to minimize wildfire risks. And I think it was a really well-crafted program, and that we have an expert on the private side and an expert on the public side, both of whom know a bit about the interplay. I'm going to start by introducing Blake Hudson, our second speaker. Professor Hudson is a professor at the University of Houston Law Center. Our new dean also hails from Houston, so this is a great coincidence. He grew up on private forest land in South Alabama, so he's speaking about a matter that's of sort of great familiarity to him based on his personal background. I've begun to look at some of his scholarship, and it's fantastic. He writes about the regulation of private forest land, and in particular focuses on challenges that arise from zoning and environmental policy and also energy policy. And for example, he has a forthcoming article, oops, have I caused that to turn off? We'll make this work. Forthcoming article in the Florida State Law Review that examines the use of southeastern forest land for pellets that might be burned in energy plants, mostly in Europe, as a substitute for coal. And so he explores many facets of this issue, including not only sort of the trade-off as between coal and wood as a fuel, but also the implications for sustainable forestry in the Southeast. And I hope that I'll have a chance to weave in some of those insights today. He'll be talking today about the need for wildfire policy in private forest land, and I think with particular reference to the southeastern United States. And our first panelist is Professor Robert Keiter, who is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Law at the University of Utah, also the director of the Wallace Stegner Center. And while we can all agree Phil Knight is our favorite namesake for a chair, I have to believe that's the second best in the United States. Wallace Stegner is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of fiction. And he is a leading conservationist as well. And this center, if you're not familiar with it, is really one of the leading centers in the United States for environmental advocacy on so many fronts. Professor Keiter has written very important scholarship, sometimes in the form of books, 2 books with the Yale University Press. And while his interests are wide-ranging, a lot of what he examines is the evolution of state and federal conservation policy. And my understanding is that today he'll focus on the evolution of wildfire policy at the federal level. Please join me in welcoming these 2 great panelists, with Professor Keiter going first.
Ever since I got the connection to Wallace Stegner, I've been trying to write like him, and I still am trying. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and to share some insights on federal fire policy connected to federal natural resource management policy. Before I get started in the slideshow and talk, I thought I'd just share just a couple of quick thoughts with you and experiences. The first one, there is a personal side to this in the sense that I have been told ever since I left the University of Wyoming and moved to the University of Utah and relocated into Emigration Canyon, which is located right behind the university, that that particular canyon is the most fire-prone canyon on the Wasatch Front mountain range there. So far, so good. But one of my colleagues, senior colleagues, shortly after I arrived there, seemed to delight in sharing stories with me about the good old days when fires indeed had burned in the canyon and had threatened the home of one of our other colleagues. At this point, again, we haven't had any major events yet. The good news is that during my tenure there, the canyon installed a water system. Previously, it had been all wells, such that there are actually fire hydrants throughout the canyon, which would be of some help in addressing a wildfire. And a firehouse has been added halfway up the canyon, which again should be of some help, but I'm not sure if we really got a conflagration going, as Lloyd was talking about earlier, that either of those things in and of themselves would be sufficient. Canyon also has been involved in wildland fire, community fire planning process and made some progress there. The second quick thought I'll just share with you is the question sometimes arises, how did I get interested in this subject of fire, which I did about 15 years ago, not that long after the 1988 Yellowstone fires. And what happened is that I was working on a book entitled Keeping Faith with Nature, Ecosystems, Democracy, and America's Public Lands. One of the principal themes in the book was that we were evolving on federal public lands into an era of ecological restoration, and we'd seen fire be accepted back onto the landscape along with predators, and most of you are familiar with the reintroduction of the wolf in Yellowstone. And I got to thinking about this, and there was an awful lot of literature available about the story of the wolf and that sort of thing. And the grizzly bear, for example, that is our relationship with those types of predators. And not that much available regarding fire. And in particular, as you might imagine, I was interested in the law regarding fire. And I started looking to see what was out there, and I found almost nothing. One law review article, if I recall correctly, that talked about the issues of smoke and fire at that point in time. I don't think there was anything else in the law review literature. A couple of non-legal people had sort of taken a stab at some of the laws relating to fire, and there was sort of a cursory coverage in some of the fire history type, fire history or fire science books, but that was about it, which in turn led me to begin to dig into, among other things, where did the federal agencies, the Forest Service in particular, but also the Interior Department agencies, get the authority to fight wildfire? And it was very easy to find the authority of that for the Forest Service. It's in their original Organic Act. There's a specific reference to fighting fire. But that's not true for the interior agencies. And I looked and I looked, and I called back to D.C., the solicitor's office, made inquiry with some people that I knew back there. They were no help. And eventually, I found the law. And it was basically sort of a one-sentence law authorizing the interior agencies to fight fire, adopted by Congress, I think largely as an afterthought in 1922. So a good ways into the 20th century, and certainly good ways after that major fire of 1910, often referred to as the Big Burn. So I'm going to focus on federal wildfire policy and law, and a quick history on this subject. Beginning with the early days of the Forest Service, we see that the agency had, and Gifford Pinchot was the head of the Forest Service, was very explicit about the need for rangers to make sure that fires did not get out of control. And there's other quotations in the what's known as the use book produced by Pinchot in 1905 as the agency was getting underway. And then another major step along the way is during the Great Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps is on the landscape, and one of the things that they did is they really opened up our public lands, and in particular our national forests, building trails and roads and that sort of thing, which provided access for firefighters into what had previously been largely remote areas. Then we see the agency adopting this 10 a.m. policy, that is that all fires would be out by 10 a.m., just a sole emphasis on suppression of fires. And that was abetted then in the aftermath of the Second World War with the presence of different surplus equipment, including airplanes. Lloyd talked about this previously, that helped to facilitate the suppression of fires. And it's around this time, actually a little bit earlier, that Biswell and others in the scientific community begin to question whether or not it makes sense for us to be extinguishing all fires, whether or not as an ecological matter they had, that is, fire had a role to play on the landscape and historically had shaped our forests, albeit in different ways. And of course, the Smokey Bear campaign in the 1950s further cements, at least for a short period of time, this all-out fire suppression policy, and it even gets wrapped up into nationalistic overtones as reflected on this World War II cartoon. So what we see is a heavy-duty emphasis on suppressing all fires, putting them out, and that begins to change during the 1960s. As the agencies with the Park Service initially, followed very quickly by the Forest Service, beginning to think that there is some role for fire to play, particularly in the backcountry, the remote areas where there simply isn't, if you will, human life is generally not at risk, nor property at risk. And so we begin to see an evolution in the policy. And that is reflected here in this graph, which shows the historical trajectory of the acres burned by wildfire in the United States, dating back to the early part of the 20th century. And you can see the spike occurring there in, let me see if I can use that, in roughly the mid-1980s as this new policy of allowing some fires to burn begins to take hold, along with the implications of climate change beginning to be felt on the landscape. And this graph simply basically reflects the same thing. This is running from simply from 2010 on up to nearly the present time. But again, you can see fire spiking during this period of time. So what's the problem with the, as a result of the suppression policies that we had followed that have changed? And this diagram provides a sense of what has occurred as we continued to put out fires. We allowed the smaller brush and smaller trees not to burn and to continue to grow, creating what is referred to as a fuel ladder, allowing flames that might otherwise have burned as a small fire along the ground in grasses and shrubs to climb up the ladder into the canopy to create what we refer to today as a crown fire, which in turn become catastrophic fire events, or certainly can with the conditions are right. And then once the fire gets into the crown, with the right conditions, embers are shot out in front, and it's very difficult for firefighters, as again already discussed, to begin to get any sort of a real handle on these sorts of fires when you have embers carrying sometimes half a mile ahead. I recall during the 1988 Yellowstone fires, everyone thought, as one of the fires was burning west to east, if I'm remembering my directions correctly, that once it hit the Snake River Canyon, if any of you are familiar with that canyon coming from the south, driving from the south from Jackson up into the park, that natural barrier, which is certainly much wider than your average fire line, would stop the fire. No such luck. Those embers carried across the Snake River, across the canyon, and the fire continued to burn. I might also note that the Yellowstone fires are often referred to as one of our contemporary major fire events. Only one of those, if I recall correctly, was a prescribed fire allowed to burn in the backcountry. And the agencies, once they realized that the weather conditions had shifted dramatically, jumped on the fires pretty quickly, and it made little difference. There was little opportunity to get ahead of that, and it wasn't until the first snow arrived in mid-September that conflagration was brought under control. As a result of fire suppression policies, the photos here illustrate the evolution, and look in the background, of the forest ecology over a century. 1895, you can see very little in the way of trees, green vegetation, major vegetation in the background. Roughly 100 years later, it looks dramatically different. Then about 15 years later, that's what it looks like after the fire has come through, with the fuel buildup near that structure, et cetera. And so that gives you a sense of the potential problems that are out there on the landscape as a result of this long-standing suppression policy that we've dealt with. And as already discussed, this is a particular problem in this WUI zone, the wildland-urban interface area, where we see houses being constructed right in the midst of heavily forested areas. And of course, that is continuing to occur with great frequency. This diagram gives you a sense of the numbers of WUI residential properties at high or very high risk of wildfire. You'll notice here in your home state that the numbers are pretty substantial. California, likewise. At any rate, you get a sense that this is a serious problem in terms of simply numbers of structures potentially at risk. One of the, if you will, factors that gives a sense of what has occurred as a result of the fuel buildup and our efforts to fight these fires that have grown in terms of numbers and size is to take a look at the federal appropriations for wildfire fighting. And you'll notice here, starting in '94, we're down about $1 billion a year, and we're basically triple that by, 2014? And that number, it's obvious the trajectory of that number, and of course, one of the implications of that is the impact on the agency, in particular the Forest Service, and its budget. And this is a pretty powerful graphic demonstrating that we already are at the point where more than half of the agency's budget is being directed toward firefighting. That means funds are not available for other types of resource management activities, and much of that money also is pulled away from our efforts through management actions to address the fire problem. So current implications, there's an extraordinary assortment of photos available on the internet related to the fire season that you've been experiencing here in Oregon. I grabbed a few that I thought would provide an illustration of the types of fires and the efforts to contain them that have been going on. This map pulled off of Google gives you a sense of the number of fires in the Pacific Northwest this fire season, and it's pretty extraordinary. Again, you all have been living through this, and clearly Oregon has been the site of some of the most intense and largest number of fires burning. I'm not sure if you're at your all-time high in the state. If you aren't, you're certainly close to it at this point. I should add that it was quite evident to me flying into Portland yesterday afternoon, flying up the Columbia River Gorge, that the smoke was heavy in the air up there. It was very difficult seeing out the plane window to the north across the gorge. Another slide giving a sense of burn acreage over the last 40-some years here in Oregon. The important point is the direction of the curve headed upward in terms of acreage burned within the state. So what are the implications here? In Oregon, you've currently got 11 active large wildfires according to the Oregonian. More than 500,000 acres burned this year. Total cost, pretty extraordinary, well over $250 million. And at the national level, according to National Interagency Fire Center, we're up approaching 50,000 fires, nearly 8.5 million acres burned this year. That's not the all-time high, but it's getting up near the all-time high in terms of acreage burned. One of the factors alluded to earlier is the phenomena of climate change. This chart simply provides a historical overview of temperature change over time. We're clearly on an upward trajectory, and that has implications for fire policy. And projections going forward, dependent upon what we do, suggest the same in terms of some continued rise in temperature throughout the remainder of this 22nd century, or 21st century, excuse me. So what are the implications of climate and warming temperatures? Less snow, earlier runoff, net effect of that, drier forests, and hence potentially more flammable forests. With warmer temperatures, more insects, more dead trees on the landscape, which can potentially provide fuel. Most importantly, we're already seeing a substantial increase in the length of fire seasons, going from in the 70s, roughly 5 months on average across the West. We're up to 7+ months now. And more large fires, as reflected in the figures here over the last 30+ years. Here in the Pacific Northwest, the same thing is true, perhaps even more so in terms of the increased fire season from around 23 days in the 70s up to well over 110 days annually. And both the frequency and the size of the area being burned has increased considerably. So what about federal fire policy? We've clearly shifted away from, as I mentioned earlier, the all-out suppression approach. And what I've got on the slide is a list of some of the key documents addressing federal fire policy over the last 25 years that one could check, pulling important principles out of those policies. We are recognizing the responsible agencies for sure are recognizing that fire is a critical natural process, that it needs to be integrated into resource management on a landscape scale. That means interagency coordination, interjurisdictional coordination. The agencies and the policies are quite firm that firefighter and public safety is the first priority, although they may not have consistently honored that principle. It certainly has been put forth pretty consistently. And again, a recognition that some sort of interagency and integrated coordination and cooperation are essential to address this. As has already been discussed, the federal agencies can do so much on their lands. What's happening on the adjoining private lands has a significant impact on how the agencies approach both fire management when fires are burning and planning for fire. I wanted to note just a couple days ago, Secretary of the Interior Zinke issued a memo to all employees in the Interior Department and he's responding obviously to the fires this season, advising his employees that you must address potential threat of catastrophic wildfire and must begin to think about fire in a new and aggressive way. And focusing on fuels management, but still linking it, at least so far, to land and resource management objectives. So fire continues to be recognized as a natural process and something to be incorporated into resource management. I included here some of the basic federal laws and policies that address fire in the context of climate. Perhaps Congress, interestingly, linked climate change and wildfire in what's known as the Flame Act of 2009, a congressional recognition of a connection between the two. That said, we do see President Trump coming into office promoting energy independence. The net effect of that has been to repeal a number of executive orders issued by his predecessor, President Obama, including the Secretary of the Interior ordering a review of the department's climate change policies. That review remains to be done, but it certainly will include Order 3289 that tells the agencies that they must analyze climate change in the context of planning and project level decisions. That order also established the LCCs, or Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, which have been a major federal entity looking at the impact of climate change on resource management policy, something that has enabled the agencies to begin to think progressively and ahead about how they should deal with this issue. It remains to be seen exactly what the implications of the Secretary's review will be. That said, when we come to the Forest Service with the new 2012, that is, planning rules, clearly wildland fire is included in those rules in the definition of ecological sustainability, one of the principal goals of forest planning and management, including the restoration of fire-adapted ecosystems, and climate and wildland fire have been linked in those regulations also. It remains to be seen, I think, with the change in administration, some of the radical policy shifts we've seen, whether there will be I don't know if it'll be a third or fourth effort to revise again the Forest Service planning rules. As some of you are aware, as a result of congressional action, the BLM, I think unfortunately, was sent back to the drawing board to redo its recently revised planning regs. That indeed did take account of fire and climate change and spoke in terms of planning and management on a landscape scale, including an assessment requirement, all gone as a result of congressional action at the beginning of this term of Congress. What are the issues for federal resource management policy dealing with fuel-loaded forests, that is accumulation of fuel, recognizing that we're dealing with different ecosystems and fire regimes. They are not the same across the West. Hazardous fuel reduction, how through thinning, that is through mechanical removal versus controlled fires, controlled burning. Where? In the backcountry, in the WUI, and most controversial, in the lands between. And how do we move forward in terms of what is an appropriate fire suppression policy, and then what do we do after the fire has come? And in particular, salvage logging has become quite controversial. I suspect most of you are aware of that here. Big question also, and of particular concern, I think, to us here at the law school would be what role for law going forward. So quickly, and I want to stay within my time allotment. And where are we on time now? Okay. The laws that come into play are many, potentially. And here I've highlighted some of the organic legislation that governs in this area. Obviously, the organic legislation for the Forest Service, and I'd mentioned earlier, going all the way back to 1897, you can see that it speaks, that is, that legislation speaks in terms of protecting the forests against destruction by fire. The Weeks Act and Clark-McNary Act, although they principally focus on the eastern part of the country, what they did recognize and provide for is the cooperative federal-state firefighting efforts written into law and provided federal funding to state and local communities. That still is part of the funding mix for firefighting. This is the law that I referred to earlier, adopted in 1922, and it's quite short, quite simple. It simply says the Secretary is authorized to protect and preserve from fires, disease, insects, etc., timber owned by the United States on the public lands, parks, and it goes on to list the other interior lands. Other pieces of organic legislation that potentially come into play when we think about appropriate policies on public lands, national parks. Interesting question. The organic legislation speaks in terms of conserving scenic and natural objects and wildlife, but then also in terms of leaving them unimpaired. The Park Service has interpreted that to allow fire to burn in backcountry areas of national parks. You have the Wilderness Act interpreted basically the same way by all of the agencies responsible for implementing it, which includes all 4 of the federal land management agencies. You've got site-specific legislation that Congress has been adopting to address specific local resource management issues that often incorporate references to fire and set up specific requirements regarding wildfire and the use of wildfire, and even sanctioning the use of controlled burning to address specific problems, or alternatively, specifically addressing hazardous fuel removal projects and the construction of barriers, the Quincy Library legislation, for example. And then the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act of 2009 provides funding for landscape restoration and the reduction of hazardous fuels through collaborative, community-based approaches to these issues. But that's not the whole story, obviously, when we talk about the legal landscape regarding wildfire on federal lands. And here I've listed a number of other laws that come into play, and come into play rather prominently when we're talking about fire management decisions. That, in turn, that is that extraordinary mix of laws led during the early days of the Bush administration, when the country was faced with extensive wildfires across the West, led the Forest Service to conclude that it simply wasn't being able to address the hazardous fuel buildup problem, and it said, we've got a process predicament. There are too many environmental laws that we have to jump through their hoops in order to address hazardous fuel buildup, in order to seek to restore in the aftermath of fires, Congress, you've got to do something about this, Mr. President. You have to do something about this. And in fact, initially, the President acted. And he came forth with, administratively, a Healthy Forests Initiative that was designed specifically to expedite fuel removal projects by modifying environmental legal requirements, including implementing a series of categorical exclusions under NEPA in order to move these projects forward without going through the full NEPA review, and shifting the consultation responsibility under the Endangered Species Act from the Forest Service, shifting the consultation responsibility from the Fish and Wildlife Service to the Action Agency to make not likely to adverse effect determinations under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. Ultimately, the courts blocked basically both of these principal initiatives. There also was an effort to move out of administrative review and to set up a pre-decisional review process in the Forest Service. This effort on the part of the President, administrative effort, was followed by Congress with adoption of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act 1 year later, with two purposes: to reduce the wildfire risk and to restore ecosystems. This is the first major piece of federal land management legislation since the mid-70s in terms of the national forests. And it's clearly directed at the wildfire. Whoops. What did I do here? Let's check some chords. Yeah.
Let's see. My students know I do this almost every day in the same room.
Must have. Oh.
I think this adapter may be part of the problem.
Can I step on something?
Let's see. I might be able to get better at that.
Close.
This is sometimes the beginning of a fix. Maybe not this time. I believe it's the adapter. I could go upstairs and get a better adapter.
Oh, we have it. No.
As with all things involving technology, we need young people to solve it. Right here will not.
Okay. Oops. So, anyway, keeping my train of thought, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act then, let me see, which one was I on? Okay. Okay. I talked about the purposes there, and dual purposes in this instance. Most importantly, the legislation, it ends up being pretty focused. It has a WUI focus priority, also concern about municipal watersheds, endangered species habitat, a cap on total number of potential projects that might be approved, excluding wilderness, old growth, requiring collaborative planning and monitoring so we can learn from what we're doing. Where it was controversial in the environmental community was that it reduced the number of alternatives that the agencies must consider, and it cemented in place this pre-decision review process rather than a full administrative review. It did keep in place judicial review, but required exhaustion and participation before one could turn to court. And if one had not participated in the planning process, they simply did not have standing to proceed into court. Interestingly enough, Congress concluded that I think the local federal courts are likely to be more sensitive to, sympathetic to the agency in moving forward, and it included a venue provision that said that litigation under this statute must be brought in the home state of where the project is challenged. They're ruling out the D.C. Courts. What's the aftermath of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act? It did not get rid of litigation by any means. There continues to be NEPA-based litigation, Endangered Species Act litigation, raising National Forest Management Act requirements, including soils requirements and monitoring requirements and diversity requirements, all found in the NFMA. Also, some of these projects are going forward in areas that are covered by other larger plans. For example, the one you'd be most familiar with here would be the Northwest Forest Plan, and it has specific standards and requirements regarding what can occur within, for example, late successional reserves, and so that factors into some of the HFRA litigation. And inventoried roadless area, particularly in Idaho, there have been a couple cases where the state has its own roadless area rule by virtue of the way that whole process ultimately evolved. And a case that's had some played some role in the litigation in this area is the Supreme Court's Winters decision from several years ago, Winters versus Natural Resources Defense Council, which basically held that simply showing environmental harm in and of itself is not going to be sufficient to merit issuance of a preliminary injunction. Courts are going to have to balance all four of the preliminary injunction standards before issuing an injunction. I've listed a few of the principal decisions that have come down primarily out of the Ninth Circuit. I probably should note that almost all of this here in the West, almost all of the HFRA litigation is confined to the Ninth Circuit. I could find very little litigation in the 10th Circuit. I included the one Colorado case that I found there, interestingly enough. Salvage litigation. That is what happens after the fire has come through. The Forest Service and timber companies are often interested in salvaging, getting some economic value out of what's left. And there's been a fair amount of in fact, probably even more litigation over salvage sales. And the purpose under the Hazardous Forest Restoration Act, again, is restoration, prevention of future fires. There's also concern about cost and jobs that's written into the legislation. And you see the same, if you will, litany of types of claims, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, here on your Oregon and California lands, FLIPMA-based claims. Roadless area rule continues to come into play occasionally, along with other plans, and the Winters Doctrine also plays a role in terms of whether or not courts are willing to issue preliminary injunctions. Some of the major cases, and the list goes on and on. I certainly didn't have an opportunity to read all of them. If I were to make how would I put it, a studied guess, I would, my sense was from what I did read that the Forest Service is winning substantially more cases than they're losing when we're talking about the HFRA and the salvage litigation, which is not to say they aren't losing some cases, but that's my guess going forward. An issue that comes up, and I'll just touch on a couple of these things very quickly, time to be moving on. That is, what about if the federal agencies, when managing fires, allegedly mismanage them such that there's damage to property or life, although the cases I've looked at all involve property. Well, tort claims can be filed against the federal government for mismanagement of fires, or that is that they're fighting, or alternatively controlled burns that get out of control. The classic instance of that, as some of you may be aware of, occurred roughly the year 2000 when Bandelier National Monument controlled burn got out of control and consumed roughly half of the town of Los Alamos, New Mexico, and almost reached the lab there. The short answer is that the government has consistently and successfully invoked what's known as the discretionary function doctrine that's found in this provision in the Federal Tort Claims Act, and asserted that its decisions regarding wildfire management, including fighting of wildfires, involves discretionary judgments, not mandatory judgments. There aren't absolute statutory standards that the agencies must follow. And secondly, that ultimately how to conduct firefighting on the ground, the courts have been convinced, is a policy judgment. And as long as those two dimensions of or standards that are written into by judicial interpretation, the discretionary function doctrine are met, no liability. And it's been very unusual that a case has found liability on the part of the government, although I might note that a relatively recent Ninth Circuit case, the Green case noted here, did find that the failure of the agencies, when they were setting a controlled burn, to notify nearby property owners when it would not have entailed any particular hardship on the part of the agency, potentially opened the agency to liability. There was not a definitive judgment. The matter was sent back to the lower courts. I didn't have an opportunity to find out what the resolution of that particular case was. And I should note more broadly, when you're talking about application of the Federal Tort Claims Act on the public lands, and this particularly comes into play not only in the wildfire context, but in the recreational context where people are injured, mountain climbing, river running, swimming, whatever, as people recreate on the public lands. Claims have been filed against the agencies over the years, including when wild animals do bad things like grizzly bears. And again, consistently the court has, or the agencies have avoided liability with the exception of a failure on the part of the agencies to warn individuals about hazards that might not be obvious. So it might be obvious if you're going to try to climb the Grand Teton that you might fall off and get hurt. But it might not be obvious if there's an area that's inviting for swimming and there's a snag underwater and somebody dives in and hits their head. And in those latter cases, failure to warn principles have come to the fore and opened the door for potential liability. Other claims, takings claims, a few have been litigated, none successfully, although the Trinco case suggests that there might be some opportunity to pursue a takings claim when a fire gets out of control, destroys property. What about the flip side of this? Does the United States have an opportunity to seek to recover if someone or some company negligently causes a fire? And the answer is yes, but by virtue of these decisions, but that ultimately turns upon negligence standards written into state law. And so that becomes an important question that also is interwoven with questions of sovereignty and what damages are potentially available under state law, and that often does not include what we think of as natural resource damages. It would include, for example, the cost of fighting the fire, but not necessarily the damage done on the ground. Occasionally, as in the Los Alamos case, Congress will step up to the plate and adopt compensation legislation. And an issue that is particularly pressing, I think, at the present time, alluded to by Lloyd earlier, is isn't there a role for the insurance companies to be playing here? And the answer, I think, is yes. I'll wrap up simply by noting that there are local and state law implications that come into play. I've noted some of them here. I think this leads into Blake's presentation. At the end of the day, the goals, it seems to me, should be restoration of resilient fire-adapted ecosystems, reduction of catastrophic fire risk, and the protection of human life and property, at least in the WUI zone, and some of the strategies that are appropriate to address that I've noted here in the final slide. If you're interested in further reading on this, in all humbleness, I've noted some of the stuff that I've written up here that addresses the fire issue. Thank you.
So I'll use that clicker and let's see.
So thanks so much to Professor Keiter for a very thorough and insightful presentation. If you're recently arriving, our next presenter is Professor Hudson from the University of Houston Law Center. And his focus will complement Professor Keiter's focus, who focused mostly on federal policy. Our next speaker will focus more on state-level policy and how it affects private forest land, with a particular emphasis on the southeastern United States. You all set?
Thanks, yeah, good to go. Appreciate it. All right, thank you. So how much of the nation's forests are federally owned and subject to all of the laws that Professor Keiter just discussed? No academics can answer. How much of the federal forests are there? Just throw out some percentages. 18%. 18%? You're like it's like my dad. He always guesses in a way that I'm like, it's not a surprise to him. When I tell you that. 35%, okay? 35%. So how much is privately owned? Well, some is state-owned. There's about 5% that's state-owned. So 60% is privately owned, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that my talk is 25% more important than his talk. But most of our forests are privately owned. And so thank you for having me here today. I'm grateful to be part of the symposium. But forests, especially private forests, hold a special place in my heart. I grew up on forest land in South Alabama that had been in my family for generations. You can see a picture of our forest here. We've got these beautiful Adamasco lilies that bloom in the valley in April, though that has been moving up every year over the last couple decades. We go back to this property as often as we can to camp out, hike, and get back to nature. And from an early age, I was involved in many of the management decisions made on this property. I worked with forest industry employees to help my family cultivate the resource for sustenance. My family now has shifted to preserving conservation values and forest ecosystem services on the property, but this piece of land was very much the impetus for me getting into this profession and for writing about private forest management. One thing that we have not historically had to worry about too much is wildfire management. We only recently took back managerial control of the property a few years ago because Weyerhaeuser, who some of you may have heard of, maintained a long-term lease on the property. They had historically performed some controlled burns on the property, and we're making plans to do the same on some of the property that remains pine timber, but we've never witnessed a wildfire, an uncontrolled fire, on our property during the generations that our family has owned the parcel. And one of the reasons why is that we live in a very wet region, even by southern standards. And so our property is right here in the dark, dark blue. So even amongst the southeast, we're as wet as, a little area in the Appalachians and then areas up in the Pacific Northwest. So we're just exceedingly wet where we are, even for the state of Alabama. But that is changing. So climate change is expected to make the South warmer and increase the length and frequency of drought conditions, setting the stage for increased wildfires. So how can the South better manage its forests for wildfire prevention and mitigation during a time of climate change? This talk introduces some of the legal and political issues that make that a particular challenge in a region like the U.S. South, especially since 86% of the forests in the region are privately owned. Very limited public lands in this entire southeastern region. And I'm going to suggest some potential avenues for wildfire management to improve the South, though I have to admit and my preliminary research is mostly background, and by January 1st, the date that our article is due, I will have some actual concrete suggestions in place. So today I'm going to talk about the risks that climate change poses to southern forests, particularly relating to wildfire risk. Then I want to discuss some of the challenges unique to the South that make addressing these issues difficult. And then finally, I want to discuss some approaches that southern state policymakers should consider to address the problem. These include not only regulatory measures, but also the potential facilitation of forest product markets that could assist in reducing fuel buildup on the forest floor that increases the risk of catastrophic fire. So somewhat contrary to conventional wisdom, the southeastern U.S. actually leads the nation in the number of wildfires per year. The region averaged approximately 45,000 fires per year at the turn of this century. And these are not the controlled burns. These are the wildfires that were not set on purpose. The southern forest fires of 2016 demonstrate what may be on the horizon more frequently throughout the southern forest landscape. The most prominent of those fires was the chimney top fire that destroyed much of the resort towns of Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, causing tens of thousands of people to evacuate, damaging 1,700 structures and killing 14 people. In 2016, wildfires burned over 1.5 million acres in the South. But it's not just Gatlinburg. Major fires have continually swept across the South the last 2 decades, causing great damage. Massive fires in Florida in 1998 consumed over 200,000 acres, while in 2007 a single wildfire destroyed over 600,000 acres in Florida and Georgia and caused $58 million worth of timber loss. In 2008, fires in North Carolina and South Carolina burned thousands of acres, destroyed or damaged 176 homes, and caused economic losses in excess of $50 million. My home state of Alabama has witnessed extreme wildfires in recent years, numbering in the thousands per year, as has Texas, where I am now. Here you can see the total acreage of fires burned, acres burned by fire in the Southeast between 1998 and 2002. And of course, the risk of wildfire in the South is accentuated because of high population densities in the region. 80 million people live in the Southeast, and it has the highest proportion of population of any region at the wildland-urban interface. And so I think this image really gives you a sense. No offense to you out here in the West, but when you see the reds and the oranges, they're just more people. You have more forests, we have more people. And so that's the major concern at this wildland-urban interface. More than 70% of the 50,000 U.S. communities on the wildland-urban interface designated as at-risk for fire are in southern states. So how does climate change affect an already combustible situation? Primarily through, you guessed it, temperature increases, changes in precipitation, and resulting drought conditions, and through a variety of secondary effects that I'll talk about here in a minute. So climate change is expected to lead to increased temperatures in the region. General circulation models predict air temperature to increase anywhere from 1.5 to 3 degrees centigrade in the Southeast over the next 50 years. And this is particularly depressing. This is the projected number of days above 90 degrees. In the 1960s and 70s, we had 75 days above 90 degrees. By the end of the century, we're projected to have over 150 days above 90 degrees, which is a significant number of days. Temperature increases have an effect on wildfires actually independent of effects on precipitation patterns, since rising temperatures increase evapotranspiration, which causes trees to pull even more moisture out of the soil, which in turn means a drier overall environment and increased risk of wildfire. One of the most startling statements I read in any of the reports that I viewed, scientifically peer-reviewed published reports, was, and this is especially so given that the southeastern U.S. is one of the most biodiverse regions of the United States with its tropical climate, is that, quote, the potential savannification of the Southeast, in which forests are converted into more open woodlands due to a combination of hotter and drier conditions, could be one of the most profound potential climate change impacts in the entire United States. Models are less clear on overall precipitation patterns, Some project a wetter southeast overall, whereas others actually predict a drier one overall. But regardless of the overall status of wet versus dry, there will be, one thing that is certain is there will be more variability in precipitation patterns, and there will be, which will result in extended periods of drought, which obviously leads to increased wildfire activity. Since the 1980s, droughts have become more frequent in the southeast. Perhaps most importantly, it will be drier for longer when it's dry, and it's going to be wetter for longer when it's wet. And in 2016, it was projected that 47 million people lived in drought-affected areas in the southeastern U.S. And you can see, the conditions very much mimic what we see out west as far as dryness. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, for example, went 65 days without rain. The previous record was 37 days. Cedartown, Georgia, went 94 days without rain. The previous record was 36 days. So it was, 3 times as long without rain in these areas. In addition to temperature and precipitation, climate change will create a number of other secondary effects. Consider insect and pest outbreaks, which has already been discussed. Climate change leads to warmer temperatures, which contributes to fewer insect die-offs in the winter and more insect outbreaks. The woody adelgid, for example, in the Great Smoky Mountains, has been sucking the sap out of hemlocks, killing them, leaving behind more standing dead trees, which are then more susceptible to fire. In addition to insects and pests, an inability of tree species to migrate, along with rapid habitat shifts, also leaves more forests susceptible to fire. Migration of tree species following the last ice age likely occurred at much slower rates than what would be required to keep pace with current and future climate change. So molecular work using chloroplast DNA suggests that these paleo rates were less than 100 meters per year, yet current global temperatures are shifting poleward at rates exceeding 1,000 meters per year. So it's 10 times the rate of habitat shifts that we saw during the last, coming out of the last ice age. And this will leave more dead trees in the wake of habitat shifts. The wildland-urban interface and longer drought periods also create a crazy cycle, if you will, of constraining prescribed burning. So each year, approximately 8 million acres of land are treated with prescribed fire in the South, which is more than any other region combined, which is for a reason. It's wetter in the South, so you don't have to worry about it getting out of control. More than 2/3 of the areas burned each year in the South are prescribed burns, and only 1/3 are due to wildfires. And the ratios of that are actually reversed throughout the rest of the U.S. Prescribed burning is necessary to keep fuels from building up, to prevent more catastrophic wildfires, but because population in the South is increasing at a rate faster than anywhere else in the nation, there are going to be more and more people at that interface. The concern that prescribed burns will escape and damage property has the potential to chill the use of prescribed burns. Even though all states but Tennessee in the Southeast have passed laws limiting liability for prescribed burns that escape into surrounding areas. And of course, people will complain about smoke, right? So there are other effects there. And not only is the wildland-urban interface and populations, but longer drought periods mean that there are fewer windows to perform prescribed burns. Because the risk of escape during dry times is increased, and then longer wet periods also means there are fewer windows to set fires because that will actually burn because it's going to be too wet, right? So it's, when you have a little rain here, a little dry here, a little rain here, a little dry here, that's great for doing prescribed burns, but it's really going to be limited during these times. Finally, wildfires aren't the only disasters that plague the South. Of course, I sound like I'm being so dramatic about it. You guys don't understand the South, but I know. Woe are us, right? But these other disasters contribute to wildfire risk. So the Southeast suffered the highest number of billion-dollar weather and climate-related disasters between 1980 and 2012, according to the National Climate Assessment. Consider that a single hurricane can convert the equivalent of 10% of the total annual carbon sequestered by forests across the United States into dead and downed biomass in these forests. Hurricane Ivan, so this is a map of Hurricane Ivan. If you recall, our property is right there. And it literally, I mean, it felt like that. It felt like a big dot dropping right on our property. It went right through our property in 2004. We lost 40% of our timber on 1,000 acres. 40%, 400 acres were just laid down on the south, I think it was the south-facing slope. I can't remember which slope it was, but all these hills, the timber was laying down. All these hills, it was standing up. It's just the nature of the way a hurricane works. So we'd never seen anything like that before or since. And so even other types of disaster compound wildfire risk, because now that dead timber is on the ground and unless you get it out. Ultimately, studies project that the annual acreage burned by wildfires will increase by 4% across the southeast by mid-century and far greater by the end of the century, with severity of wildfire increasing by over 10%. Some models project that the fire seasons for the entire southern U.S. will be 2 to 3 months longer on average by the end of the century. Okay, so that's the context. So what are the challenges facing policymakers in the South for addressing these problems? I would argue that it's the policymakers themselves. That's the number one hurdle. So tell them to look in the mirror. Unlike out west, and I know, I hear you when you say Colorado's anti-regulatory, but you hadn't seen anti-regulatory until you come to the southeast. Yes, it is. Unlike out west, in the Midwest, the Northeast, there's a decided lack of state-driven regulatory constraints on private forest management. And I keep trying to stop citing this work because people are like, you write the same thing over and over again, but it's always relevant, so I have to keep citing this. So Professor Ben Kishore and Constance McDermott at the Yale School of Forestry did a study to talk about the different types of forest management policies that are available. You've got procedural, so are we going to require you to have forest management plans, or are we going to suggest that you have forest management plans? So your procedural plans can be voluntary or mandatory, or we might say prescriptive. They use those words interchangeably. And then you've got substantive standards. So what kind of substantive standards? So riparian buffer zones, which is, leave 30 feet of trees along a watershed to protect the watershed from nutrient pollution and also the fisheries and whatnot. Road decommissioning, culvert size, clear-cut limits, right? So you can't clear-cut over 40 acres or whatever. Reforestation timeframes, limitations on annual allowable cut. And they ranked jurisdictions around the world based upon the level of prescriptiveness of these forest management policies. This just demonstrates, kind of where different jurisdictions, how prescriptive they were on that scale. This is a better representation. So you had Alberta, British Columbia, New Brunswick, California, and the U.S. Forest Service ranked a number 9 on the scale. Ontario, Quebec, Washington, an 8. Oregon, a 7. So pretty good. Idaho, 5. Alaska, 4. Louisiana, Virginia got a 2. The rest of the southeastern U.S., Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, a 1. Okay. Developing countries, 6.7. 9 southeastern states and 1.2. Now, does that mean that developing countries necessarily manage their forests better than we do in the southeast? No, not necessarily, right? If you can have law on the books that's not implemented and enforced, which you see in Brazil, which has strong policies on the books, and then you have the southeastern U.S. where you have voluntary best management practices, but the big warehousers and international papers, they know to put riparian buffer zones in their watersheds. It's good silviculture. They know to do that even though it's not required. The point is, in the southeastern U.S., it's all voluntary best management practices. And so they say you should leave 30 feet of trees along your watershed. So when our neighbor, who was decidedly not a warehouser, sophisticated warehouser forester, cut their trees all the way down to the stream bank, and then 3 years later, our trees were taken out of commission because it eroded so bad, I couldn't call up the state forester and say that dummy cut his trees down to the stream bank, slap him with a fine. There's no law. All I could do, I discovered later, was bring a private nuisance claim, right? And our family didn't have the sophistication or the abundant resources to do that. So it's kind of like the Wild West, okay? Federal government does not prescriptively regulate private forests. Now, yes, there's a Clean Water Act that can have effect on private forest management. There's the Endangered Species Act. There's no federal involvement, direct federal involvement in these types of forest management policies. So that's the regulatory environment that we're in. And from our research thus far, I have found that wildfire is treated somewhat differently. There are numerous state laws in the South related to restrictions on fire during drought conditions, so there are some restrictions in place. There are tax assessments for fire prevention and for fighting fires, which goes to state agencies that go to fight fires. And there are certification requirements if you're going to be engaged in prescribed burns. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot else. And I've got an email into Ben Kishore to kind of talk about what else would you do, from a forest management perspective. I have to be honest, I'm not up to speed on what those policies would look like, but I'm going to look at some other states out west and otherwise to see what types of things forest owners might be required to do to help mitigate wildfire risk. But I can say today that southeastern forest owners need to get serious about being more involved in basic forest management practices if we're going to develop any kind of adaptive forest management policy. I don't have any answers to what that looks like today, but I plan to look into this further and figure out what those would look like. But this is the regulatory environment in which we exist, which makes it a challenge to implement any type of suggested policy. One potential tool, and again, this may be a bit far-fetched too, but I wasn't going to bring this up except they kept talking about it in the wildfire policy, the wildfire articles that I was reading, the peer-reviewed journals, is the ability of markets to help. So here's a telling quote on that point from one wildfire study. Concerns about southern timber markets have shifted from a focus on supply issues to a focus on demand issues. The South has supported a more than doubling of timber production over the last 30 years, and forecasting models show the region can easily supply even more timber. The question is whether future demand will rise as fast as available supply. Evidence does not support continuing strong demand for pulpwood, at least not for paper production. This may be due in part to an increase in the use of recycled fiber in many paper products. Customer demand for engineered and wood products is increasing, but so far rising demand for these products has not been sufficient to offset declines in demand for pulpwood of the paper sector. And indeed, since 1998, the forest products industry has divested approximately 75% of its timberland holdings. You know what we had to do to get out of the lease with Weyerhaeuser? Just let them cut a few trees. And they just gave us, they just let us out of the lease. They just wanted to be rid of dealing with our land. The pulp and paper products industry is moving overseas. One of the interesting findings from various wildlife studies is captured in this quote. If prescribed burning use becomes more limited, and Bob talked about this a little bit, harvest, you talked about the mechanical removal of timber. Harvest for biomass utilization show the greatest promise as fuel reduction techniques, as biomass removal for fuel power generation can also lead to reductions in global CO2 emissions. Now that latter part of that statement is subject to some scientific debate, and I won't talk about that today. We can talk about it some other time, about whether it really is a closed loop carbon system or not, or whether, even if it is, if it's over such a long time period, that it pushes us past a carbon tipping point, right? So we can talk about that afterwards. But I've recently written about one form of biomass, wood pellets, and its market potential to help keep southern forests forested. So let me give you a little background on that before talking about it in relation to combating wildfire, and then I'll wrap up so we can get to lunch. So wood pellets are increasingly used to power electric generation facilities in Europe and to provide electricity and heating in a growing number of other countries. In the U.S., in fact, wood pellet generation on an individual home basis has increased dramatically in the Northeast. At present, global wood pellet demand is being supplied primarily by southern U.S. forests. And many in the environmental community have looked upon this as an environmental negative. And it may very well be that it's a negative. I try not to, I do have my own thoughts on that. I mean, most of the southeastern U.S. forests are already being cultivated in this way for pulp and paper, or have historically. I don't think, these companies aren't going after primary timber right now. They're going after the scraps that are left after timber operations. They're actually going to lumber mills and taking their scraps, right? It's not to say they couldn't at some point go after primary timber, and plus a lot of these companies are in Europe and they've got restrictions on the sustainability of the resource where they're pulling from. They're audited and they have to make sure they're pulling from places that are managed for water quality, biodiversity, and things like that. It could end up being a negative. But I argue that a thorough assessment of whether it's a negative or not should take into account the potential of forest conversions to other uses when deciding if burning trees will be a net negative for both the climate and for the ecology of southern forests. And I think this is something that if you have a Western mindset, a Western forest mindset, it's easy to see how that can be negative. And what I mean by that is it's interesting that in Oregon and Washington and California, the state standards for private forest management are higher, not just for public forest management. And Kishore theorized that there's this public forest spillover effect, that the higher percentage of public forest you have in the state, there are fewer people of your voting populace that are owning private forests, and more people have this mindset of forests are for everybody and we need to protect them. And so they regulate private forests more stringently, right? But you don't have that in the Southeast. And so if private forests aren't being used for as pulp and paper or some market, then they're likely to be used for something else, whether it's agriculture, urban development, or otherwise. And this is particularly true since states with the most private forests are the ones least likely to have any regulatory controls in place. And this applies to land use planning too. Show me a urban growth boundary outside of Lexington, Kentucky, which does have one, but that's just because they care about their horses, not because of the trees. My wife's from Kentucky, so I can say that. And so, you know, the U.S. Forest Service has a report called the Southern Forest Futures Report that projects that, you know, we could lose 13% of our southern forests over the next 50 years. And so that would be like going from this to this. So it took me a long time to do, by the way. So this could be a huge problem. And most of that's caused by urbanization from population influx. So what do we do about this? So U.S. forests have a dynamic history. They've returned to fairly stable levels just last century. Forests in the U.S. are roughly the same acreage that they were in 1910, even though there's been a tripling of harvest rates during that time period. But we've got this risk of urbanization. Pulp and paper markets are moving away. It becomes more valuable for me to sell my timber to a developer for urban development or agriculture than to keep it a forest, right? And that becomes a problem. This is not the first time, though, that southern forests have been threatened in this way. And the last time that it occurred, the development of new forest product markets was crucial to southern forest recovery. So here's some images of what the South used to look like. This is a fascinating study. William Boyd, who's now at UCLA Law, has written this study. He's got a new book out, The Slain Wood, I believe it's called, that talks about this. But by the late 1800s, the southern states had exploited their forests almost out of existence, leading to what one scholar called probably the most rapid and reckless destruction of forests known to history. And William Faulkner is the one who coined the term the slain wood. Much of this forest degradation was due, ironically, to uncontrolled fires, which consumed up to a full 3/4 of all of the forest in some southern states. In fact, the South accounted for 85% of all forest fires in the country in the 1930s. And nearly half of these fires resulted due to the, quote, deep-seated cultural practice of annual woods burning that was part of the very fabric of rural life in the South. So apparently, Southerners maintained a cultural predilection to throwing big fire parties, drinking a lot, and setting the woods on fire. This was a thing, seriously. So it took me even longer to do this. No Italians were harmed in the creation of this Photoshop. And the reason they would do this is because the perverse tax policies that the state had in place at the time, it was a liability to own forests, and so they just burn them down. Okay? So as a result, the federal government, a number of the statutes that Bob talked about earlier, there were a number of statutes aimed at curbing this fire problem, assisting states in reforming state and local forest taxation practices that encourage this premature cutting or lighting on fire of timber. And President Roosevelt actually called for federal prescriptive regulation of private forests in the South. And the mere threat of federal regulation played a role in changing the market environment and the management approach for southern forests. Pulp and paper firms moved to a system of conservation, regeneration, and minimum standards for forest protection, and they encouraged non-industrial private landowners to do the same. This effectively forestalled federal action and saw states facilitate expansion of forest product markets. These steps ultimately turned the southeastern forest into what is known as the wood basket of the world. And since 1986, if the South were compared with any other country, none would produce more timber than this one region of the U.S. Thanks in large part to the spotted owl and other issues that arose. Yeah, so that I have to give credit where it's due. But the pulp and paper industry has increasingly moved their operations overseas, and particularly to Asia, as you can see in this chart at the bottom, leaving forest owners with fewer markets into which to introduce their timber, while at the same time urban development is proceeding more rapidly in the South, as I mentioned, than any other part of the country. Many of the people waiting to purchase this forest land, either divested from large timber companies or private individuals, are real estate investment trusts. Some of these organizations may value the conservation of the forest resource, but many more care about the underlying land and its potential conversion to non-forest uses. Southern forest owner parcels are becoming increasingly smaller as landowners age and their children are becoming more urbanized. 61% of private forests in the South are now between only 1 and 9 acres. Smaller parcels are more likely to be developed and never return as a working forest. And so today, climate change creates a new fire problem for the South, right? And it has the potential to not only bolster wood pellet markets and help keep forests forested, but also provide an avenue for reducing wildfire risk. Wood pellet markets have expanded rapidly over the last decade or so. Dozens of manufacturers are concentrated in the Southeast at present, with many more in development, and the U.S. is the single largest wood pellet producer in the world. One recent report projects that the value of global wood pellets is projected to rise from $6.2 billion in 2014 to $20 billion by 2023. The biggest share of this market is for heating, a 70% share in 2014, though a growing amount is being used for electricity generation. Europe is the primary buyer of U.S. wood pellets, but the market's expanding in the Asia Pacific, Central and South America, the Middle East, and Africa. As for Europe, you can see that nearly half of all of its renewable energy comes from wood. Here's an image of the Drax electricity wood pellet facility across the river from LSU in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Drax is an English power company that has converted 3 of its 6 boilers from coal-fired to wood pellet-fired. In 2015, they generated 43% of their electricity from wood pellets, and by 2016, that number had jumped to 65%, and their goal is to be 100% biomass. Their wood pellets accounted for 16% of the UK's renewable energy in 2016. Coal contributed just 9% of Britain's electricity during 2016, down from 42% in 2012. Carbon emissions fell, depending on how you calculate it, I understand somebody's going to throw something at me, fell from the generation of electricity at Drax's power station by 53% in 2016. So wrapping up, exports from the U.S. to Europe as a whole doubled between 2012 and 2013 and are projected to increase another 65% by 2019. And you can see at this chart, even as pulp and paper mills have been closing down over the last 20 years in gray, even more wood pellet plants have opened to fill the void. So I'll close by just noting that these markets may be critical because Southern timber owners are losing other important markets that make it more valuable for them to keep their forest land forested than converted to agricultural or urban development uses. And furthermore, perhaps wood pellet markets could provide a double dividend by providing a means to combat wildfire. Seeing this relationship with biomass markets and wildfires emerge from various studies caused me to think this is another potential route of attack in the South for reducing fuel buildup, particularly if prescribed burning windows are shrinking. So I think it's worthy of exploration in addition to needed regulatory changes at the state level on private forest land. So, thank you very much.